And there we are. Sorry for the delay, folks. We had a little bit of technical difficulty, as we sometimes do on Mondays. But here we are, 1 o'clock. It's Deal Doctor Livestream. Paul and Eric were both going to join us today, but had some conflicts come up. So Tracy Johnson and I are going to do our best to share some thoughts about some of our greatest hits.
Yeah. So at the end of the day, you just get me. I mean, there's Don, there's Eric, there's Paul, and then there's just Tracy. So I apologize.
No, Tracy, you probably run into more of the stuff with because you're kind of overseeing all of us out here with, trafficking various situations to broker support people. So you probably are the best one to be here. Did I save that at all?
As long as others can't hear it, I'm okay with it.
Okay. Anyway, we're going to start right off with the number one problem area, and that is blanks in contracts. It's the number one reason for real estate lawsuits in the state of Michigan. And so Tracy, in your experience, what happens when you have blanks in contracts?
Well, ultimately you have problems. So because you've left it ambiguous as to what your intentions were. What was the intention of your client when they instructed you to write a purchase agreement on their behalf? And so beyond the purchase price and the number of days for inspections, there are so many elements in the purchase agreement where if we leave them blank, we've not indicated what our wishes were. And so when we don't give details, even fine details with regard to just appliances, list them out. Right. If they're not there, they're not there. Like when you get to the house, if the washer and dryer and the refrigerator are gone, if it was listed on the listing ticket, right, on the MLS, that's one thing. And we saw it there, but if it's not in the purchase agreement, it's unclear.
So if you leave it blank under the things to remain with the home, mm-hmm. Even though it's on the MLS, even though it's indicated on the seller's disclosure statement, it's not part of the deal unless you put it in the purchase agreement. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah. And at the end of the day, the buyer could say, well, they advertised that it was, they were leaving it. Well, that is now going to be up to a judge to decide what the true intentions were. And they will no doubt point back to that purchase agreement.
Right. And when you leave blanks, it does leave that intention, whatever those intentions are, unclear. And so there's not a communication of the desires of the buyer and the motives of the seller. So there's not been a clear communication. There's not been a clear meeting of the minds, which is really essential to an enforceable contract.
Yep.
Let me throw another one out there. Some years ago, we had a contract, a buyer's agency contract that didn't have a date on it. Mm. The agent left off the start date to the contract, because we didn't know when it was going to start. It was going to start, well, whenever they wrote an offer. Mm. Well, guess what? When they got around to writing an offer, they forgot to plug in a date on the buyer's agency contract. Guess what? That created an unenforceable contract. That agent gave up her commission because she didn't include a start date on the contract, and it was therefore unenforceable. Mm. So these blanks in contracts that we keep talking about are really, really important. If you get to something where it says, for example, propane or well and septic inspection, and it's on city water and sewer, put something in there that says like does not apply, NA, something essentially as a placeholder.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and at the end of the day, if it doesn't apply to your, something like propane is a great example. Don't just leave it empty. At least put a dash in it. If you at least put a dash there, that shows intention of it not applicable, right? A dash, but empty means I forgot to fill this out. To me, that's what it says.
Oh, absolutely true. And that kind of brings us to the, I'm going to jump to unclear expectations. Mm-hmm. And this goes, the unclear expectations is really an issue, particularly when it has to do with earnest money deposits. when buyers write an offer, when we write an offer for a buyer, sometimes buyers will think that they give you an earnest money check and you're not going to deposit that right away.
Hmm.
Is that correct?
No.
He says sarcastically.
Yeah, right.
No, this is part of what agents need to communicate to their buyers, that this is in fact going to be cashed at the earliest opportunity. In fact, it has to be deposited within, by the broker within 2 business days of receipt. So that's
Right.
a really important thing.
Yeah. I love using that word love and affection, that you're telling the seller, listen, I have so much love and affection for your home right now, today, that I love it so much that I promise that I'm going to set aside some of the monies that will eventually become part of the transaction. But I'm going to do that today because, oh, I just love your house so much. Right.
I love that phrase, love and affection.
Yeah.
Let's remember, I'm writing that down right
Yeah,
now.
I do, because it's a nice way to communicate that I'm buying it today. And
Mhm.
this is my pause that I'm going to ask you to put on the home in terms of your marketing the home anymore, because my love and affection is so great that I'm going to wrap my arms around you today and give you a promise to buy.
Okay. What happens, again, setting expectations. Let's talk about what happens with EMDs. If a earnest money deposit is put in place, and then the buyer decides based on inspections that they want to terminate or whatever, what happens to that earnest money deposit if for some reason the deal falls apart due to inspections? Do we,
Yeah.
if we're the buyer's agent, do we write out a check and hand it to them right away? What happens then?
Yeah, we get a lot of calls about this.
Yes,
And
we
the
do.
problem becomes exactly this. When we enter into a buyer's agency contract with our buyers, some of the conversations we should be having are about things just like this.
Mhm.
And that is setting the expectation early before you've written a purchase agreement. So we make sure there's less emotions involved
Mhm.
once that PA is written. If we're able to tell them, excuse me, that if we happen to get an accepted offer, if we're fortunate enough, or when that happens, because we know it will happen, in this market, it happens quicker than it used to. But if the buyer, you as the buyer, decide that you would like to walk away from a purchase agreement, I think what you and I hear and the rest of our team and broker support and deal doctors is we hear, we're getting your EMD back. We're going to get it back. As soon as we send that, cancel the contract, refunding the EMD, you're going to get your money back. And that's not exactly true. We're hopeful, but it's a two-party situation. We need the seller to sign and the buyer to sign, and we can't force the other side to do it.
Right.
Right.
So if the seller feels for some reason, whatever it might be, that they're entitled to that,
Mhm.
then it's out of our hands. We have to remain a neutral party, according to the
Right.
state of Michigan. We have to remain neutral in that argument. We can't suddenly hand off an EMD to a buyer because they feel that they're entitled to it.
Even though we want to, I mean, it's our desire.
Right.
But what we have to do is we have to behave within the confines of that purchase agreement. So if it said we're going to do our inspections within 7 days, and we're going to let the seller know within 2 days of our inspections what the outcome is, as long as we have behaved inside the terms of that purchase agreement, when we cancel that purchase agreement and send that mutual release, we know we have done our part according to the contract.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about trash, debris at possession. We run into this. In fact, I had this actually already this morning.
Oh, nice.
Yes, I did. Buyer moves in. We were representing the buyer.
Mhm.
Actually, we were representing the seller also. And so we are in as a broker, a dual agency position here. And so the buyer moves in, and guess what? The place is a mess.
Mm.
And so the buyer is coming back and saying, well, what are you going to do about it? And I said, why are you asking me? I'm not party to the contract. You're not party to the contract. The listing agent isn't party to the contract. This is a matter between the buyer and the seller.
Mhm.
We have no power as the brokerage to enforce the contract. Zero power. Now, can we sometimes find a meeting of the minds and negotiation over something like this, what's the buyer's agents in this particular situation where they take over a house and it's trashed? What's the buyer's first step?
The buyer's first step should be, well, I mean, I would have my client reach out to me. That's really what would happen. I would reach out to the seller's agent and say, are you aware of this situation? It's been brought to my attention today. Obviously, we've closed on the home. I would, did we do a final walkthrough? There's a lot of things that go through my mind. When did the final walkthrough take place? Were there possession after close? Was there an expectation set in advance of that closing? Was there something written in the purchase agreement to help protect that buyer? Especially knowing in this case, as you've described, we possibly had a seller's agent who became a dual agent and was representing both parties. So all the more reason that in advance to get your pen out and say to both parties, hey, okay, so there's going to be some possession after close, or what's the expectation? Should we hold some escrow to cover the buyer in the event that, number one, the seller overstayed their welcome, number two, left a bunch of trash, it wasn't broom clean.
Right. So, and again, so much of this is setting expectations for both parties, for both the seller and the buyer, that seller, if you don't clean this place up, you could potentially be faced with a lawsuit for, to get it resolved. Likewise with the buyer, hey, 9 times out of 10, everything goes smoothly, but there's a possibility that something might be left behind. So again, it's part of us setting expectations here. Let's talk about deadlines in a contract. Let's shift to that for a moment.
Okay.
And the question I have is, what do deadlines mean in a contract? Do they mean anything at all? Are the contracts time is of the essence, or not?
Well, depending on the contract, but essentially the deadlines in the contract are the framework with which we work within. So it's sort of our homework assignment as buyer's agents or seller's agents, depending on which we are. But they're the things that you should be having a file folder and writing on the outside of your file folder, the things that you need to pay attention to and the places that we want to try to hold all parties accountable to. We can't make people perform. We're not a party to the contract, but we can help foster and encourage a healthy relationship and a healthy timeline inside the purchase agreement.
So you're right. Agents should always look at their own purchase agreements because, for example, GCAR has some boilerplate language toward the end of it that says this is a time is of the essence contract. Read that one more carefully. Read it carefully and understand what it means and what it doesn't mean. Because even though it says time is of the essence contract, all dates must be adhered to. There are no consequences stated within that boilerplate language. So if you really want to make it a true time is of the essence contract, you're going to have to state what the consequences are for any of these deadlines being missed.
Yeah.
In Grand Rapids, for example, in the West Michigan Regional Purchase Agreement, it is not a time is of the essence contract, which brings us to another question. My favorite, kicking the can down the road. Can you help share a little bit on that one?
Yeah, well, there's always ways to kick the can down the road. I'm thinking about it, addendums to the purchase agreements in the Metro Detroit area. Much of them a lot of these brokers have developed their own addendums for timelines associated with the actual close no later than date. Basically saying, hey, we're not in charge of the lender. We can't make the lender perform. So we're all going to sign an agreement in advance that says we agree to keep kicking the can down the road, essentially with the purchase agreement towards a closing date, but we can't be held accountable for whatever the lender may or may not do. Essentially, whatever the buyer may or may not be doing as well. Because sometimes we know we miss targets based on the fact that sometimes we have a buyer that maybe didn't provide all their documentation in a timely manner. And now we have a seller's agent knocking on the door saying, hey, gang, we have a closing date coming. And we know that the buyer did not, do what they were supposed to be doing in terms of moving the purchase agreement along in a timely fashion. So I love these little addendums that we're asked to sign in the beginning. that essentially tell us we can't be cuffed to a deadline, a closing deadline.
And I think that ultimately that was the purpose of the language or lack thereof in the West Michigan Regional Purchase Agreement. But when you have no stipulated consequences in as it regards time frame, they become contracts that are not enforceable, deadlines that can't be enforced. So there's also the issue of lack of specificity. I use that word. There are no dates and times. There's no consequences. There may be contradictory language in the contract or any of those sort of things. What do we suggest to agents to make sure that when they're writing an addendum or a contract, other provisions where they have some freedom to author that section, what do we recommend to agents when they're faced with that?
When in doubt, write it out, right?
Yeah. And so when we write it out, what are the things that we're looking for? I know that we're looking for consequences, that whatever we're asking to happen happens within a specific time frame. What happens if that time frame is not met, or the stipulations, whatever they might be, have not been completed? What happens then? What is
Well, some examples of that might be something like this. Say your seller is being asked, you represent the buyer. Your seller is being asked to make repairs. And we see this one a lot, don't we? Both the broker support team and our deal doctors. When you write an addendum and you are asking a seller to make repairs on behalf of a buyer, the word is consequences, right? That the seller is going to perform these duties and provide evidence of corrections by this date, this time, whatever it might be, without those other details, like who's going to do the work? When will the work be completed? How will the buyer receive evidence that the corrections that were done? So all of those elements are important to the details about, okay, we've got a plumbing leak. Okay, well, great. The seller's going to get it fixed. Who will fix it? Who will pay for it? And at what timeline will the buyer receive the actual evidence that the correction was done by a licensed contractor? Or is Uncle Joe going to come over and do it on the weekend? So you have an opportunity to really nail it in and seal it up tight to make sure that those corrections are done in a way that are pleasing to the buyer, because that's who you represent.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's such an important point, is if you don't know who's going to do the work, then you have to clarify, who does your buyer want to have do the work? Is it okay if Uncle Joe does the work, or do they want a licensed contractor in there? And yes, are they going to verify that licensed contractor in fact did the work up to code, up to good and workmanlike standards? And if that doesn't happen within the time frame, what happens then? Does the buyer have the right to walk away? Does the buyer have any legal options if those things are not done within the context and time frame?
Yeah, I personally love to go to my inspection report, and I love to copy and paste the exact language from my inspector that indicated what the defect was. That way I've taken my personal opinion out. I've ripped it right from the headlines, right? This is what needed to be done. He will often write work to be performed by a licensed contractor. And then it makes it really simple. And then my last statement is always, seller to provide evidence of correction to buyer in writing by X day prior to closing.
Yeah. And finally, one hint that I'm going to share with everyone is many years ago, I think there were 13 stars on the flag when I started selling real estate. Sorry, that was my own old joke. But I very early on got a buddy in the system. I got a buddy to work with. And so I would, we would play off one another, and I would show him an addendum or clause in a contract that I had written. And I would say, pick it apart. Tell me what's wrong with it. Likewise, he would do the same with me. And we honed our skills in preparing contract information, contract language, which, we still use today. So I would encourage agents to do that. And if you have any questions, we've got a broker support team that's top notch. Reach out to your broker support person. or the deal doctors, and we'll help you. So any questions? I don't see any questions popping up here on the thread. But if you have questions, by all means, feel free to ask them, and we will answer them throughout the day. So,
Yeah, beautiful.
Tracy,
Who knew that you were starting your deal doctoring education way back, when there were 13 stars on the flag? Who knew that you
okay,
would
we
be
don't
a deal doctor?
we don't need to dwell on it, okay?
No, excellent, good advice though, but really good content. These are really important things. They're calls that we get every single day. And oftentimes you don't know what you don't know until you needed to know. But today is a good day to start diving in to figure out how to avoid problems down the road. So
Thank you, Tracy. Thanks for joining. If you have any questions, post them, and we'll see you next week.
sounds great. Thanks, Don. Have a good one. Bye, everybody.